Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me at the market site in Times Square, New York City, we have Hafeez Lakhani. He's a college admissions expert with Lakhani Coaching. We're going to take a look at international college admissions. They're lower, and is that impacting the U.S. economy? It's great to have you with us at market site.
And thanks for having me.
College admission rates, do you think that could eventually impact the U.S. economy as they move lower?
Sure, absolutely. First, it'll impact U.S. students in the sense that the Open Doors report that came out last November reported across the board international enrollments down at undergraduate, graduate, and non-degree seeking students. What that does is it creates a little bit of a gap, right? So either international students who can still afford to apply to the U.S. have an opportunity for better acceptance rates. And on the margin, slightly, even at places like Harvard or Stanford that have 4% acceptance rates, you have a small advantage coming in for domestic students seeking those most elite admission spots.
All right, now college admissions, a really big part of the conversation earlier in 2019 with admission scandals. University of California, it's looking at a lawsuit now.
Absolutely. For a long time now, for at least 4 or 5 years, the trend has been toward class diversity. That's a really important conversation right now at admissions. 20 years ago, it was about race diversity. Today, class diversity. So right now, the lawsuit with the University of California is centered on, yes, if you have means, you have more access to resources. You have more access to tutoring. You have more access to classes, even internet access to be able to use free resources like Khan Academy to improve your test scores. Now, rightfully, University of California is evaluating whether there's a bias in terms of whether testing is excluding some students. I would argue that testing is a necessary part of evaluating problem-solving ability, and that colleges, especially University of California, are doing a fantastic job of looking at those scores in the context of class. So for example, on a 1600 scale on the SAT, if you're applying from Choate, one of the elite boarding schools in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, a 1500 is good, but you know, it's not gonna like blow anyone away. If you're applying from a low-income school, like our first Lakhani scholar applying from Carver High School in Atlanta, even a 1200 is gonna blow someone away. So colleges are gonna look at those scores in context of what is your family education history? Are you the first in your family to go to college? What's the kind of income level and resource level in your environment? How many APs are offered at your school, et cetera?
Right, I mean, but it almost creates a cycle of unfairness, if I'm understanding this correctly, because then you have a pool of students that do have access, like, for example, from Choate that can get online coaches or coaching opportunities like you offer, which could eventually make it unfair for them because then you have this competition all the way up at the top. Do you think there is a cycle of unfairness here, or is there a better way for the admissions process? Maybe it doesn't have to be based just on standardized testing.
Sure, and it's not based only on standardized testing, right? So I always say to all of our clients, whether we're talking about clients from private schools in Manhattan or elite private schools across the world, we always say know your bucket, know against whom you are going to be compared in the admissions cycle. One thing that came out, and I think very fairly during the Harvard Asian American lawsuit, is that colleges are doing a really good job thinking about filling various demographics. And it's not just about race, it overlaps with class. They're thinking about, you know, are we accepting enough students from Arizona? Are we accepting enough students that are low income? Are we accepting enough students from Central Asia, right? So they're always thinking about trying to create a really interesting mix. When we talk about selective admissions, for a long time now, we don't emphasize testing as the most important element. We say, if you want to get into an extremely selective place, let's say Brown University, Yale University, Stanford University, we're talking about acceptance rates 4%, 6%, 8%. We say what you need to ask yourself is, how are you doing at cultivating a fulfilling high school career? And we define that in 3 major paradigms. One is academics, including course selection. 2 is problem-solving ability. Testing is one indicator of that. There are other indicators as well. And 3rd and most important is character. And character is the one that we emphasize most. And we say, look, when we talk about character, we want to envision, say, Stanford, 4% acceptance rate. Let's imagine that Stanford is a dinner table with a limited number of seats. If there's 1 seat left at that dinner table, what makes our student Jill the most interesting person to deserve that last spot? What does she add to the dinner table conversation? At that point, you know, for example, one of our scholarship winners is a Mexican-American student who was brought across the U.S.-Mexico border on foot by a relative at age 2. That's part of her character story. She's overcome enormous obstacles to get to be a straight-A student. And again, when we talk about the problem-solving ability, yes, her testing may be lower than some of those students who come from families with 2 PhD parents, but that's going to be taken into context.
Right. What about a lottery system? Or is that just too simple? I mean,
You know, people talk about the lottery system. In fact, you know, in some ways it is a lottery system already, in the sense that there are too many qualified candidates. Another fact that came out of the Harvard admissions lawsuit is that they could fill their class twice over with perfect or near perfect scores on ACT or SAT, right? So at some point there are too many amazing candidates, and this is where the elite colleges are doing a great job of saying, look, we're not going to go after only the top grades, top scores. We're going to focus on that character element, and we're going to create an interesting, diverse community. I often say 90% of my education at Yale came from my peers. These colleges are doing a great job saying, well, let's make sure that peer mix is a really interesting mix where people are learning from each other. As far as the lottery system, I always say all you need is one, right? When we're talking about students applying to Penn, students applying to pretty much any college that has a lower than 15% acceptance rate, we say, look, all you need is one, right? So there's no guarantee. A couple of years ago, I had a student apply to Brown, early decision, New York City private school student, fantastic candidate, incredible grades, incredible scores, had started a small business the summer before senior year, really interesting character story, had a lot to give to that dinner table conversation, was flat out rejected from Brown on the early cycle. He asked me, Hafeez, am I crazy? Am I aiming too high? I said, listen, naturally, you can feel a little bit intimidated here, and maybe you want to add a safety or two, but I think you're still an amazing candidate. And he asked me, should I keep Stanford as my reach? At the time, Brown's admissions rate was about 9%, Stanford was about 4%. Even harder to get into Stanford. And I said, I think you'd still be an interesting candidate. I think you should go ahead and apply to Stanford.
Right.
And guess where he's graduating this year?
Stanford.
Stanford. So all you need is one. It's not a perfect science. So in a sense, it is a little bit of a lottery already, but know your bucket, know your candidacy, make sure your character story is interesting, and it's worth putting your name in the hat.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to see how this is going to evolve, for sure.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you so much for joining us at MarketSite.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining me on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.